going to be what your audience wants to read or what they want you to write. So you can
Yeah,
change it up. Okay.
right. Revisions over revisions.
Right.
Well, welcome everyone to our distance and learning hour. And I see some new faces, so we'll definitely make some opportunity for introductions. And I see some familiar faces. And normally we wanted to dedicate this hour of our distance and learning hour to reflecting on our first webinar workshop experience with Pachaysana's storytelling for social change. And as Richard had mentioned last time, uh, part of it is those of us who participated can kind of reflect on our experiences and what we've made of that workshop over the course of this week, but also inform people who are not at the workshop, of some of our experiences and reflections. And then kind of open it up to like what are some of the prompts that happen, and what types of discussions do they lead to more broadly and from our respective fields and things like that. So just with that general sort of introduction, I'll maybe pass it over to Richard, and we definitely want to do some introductions with Malcolm, and I saw somebody else pop up just a second ago, but I'll go ahead and pass it to Richard here.
Thanks, Michelle. And yeah, so the important thing in these, so we meet every week. And this means that we have workshops for some of the weeks. And let me just, so everyone, I'm sure this is how you got here, but let me put in the chat the website that tells you which weeks are workshops, which weeks are reflections, and which weeks we're just calling our distance and learning hour, which is in many ways the kind of impetus to have such regular meetings. And so I think what's important for anyone that's here for the first time, as well as those that are back, is that it's very kind of low stakes in the sense of you can be here one week and not be here the next week. And the point of doing it every week is to somehow generate within 1 hour a sense of kind of our community and some of the main issues in our community, and also a kind of a record of these ongoing conversations with changing personnel throughout this. So I'm grateful for everyone to be here, and we do want people to attend regularly, but it's just so there's this element of when you can make it, you make it, and if you can't, that's fine. And as Michelle said, this idea of kind of introducing ourselves each time, but also having a space to reflect what happened the previous week, threads that follow through from week to week. If the personnel in the meeting change, then there's that sense in which we have to have a responsibility to briefly communicate or summarize what happened the previous week. And so there's that sense of continuity and passing on that I think is important to us too. So I think what's probably best actually is if we welcome those of you who are here for the first time, and maybe you could just say a couple of words about yourselves. And just, this is as far as I know, and I could get this wrong, so Malcolm and Emily, I don't know if this is your first time or is this I just haven't seen you for a while, but anyway, maybe introduce yourselves and maybe explain what prompted you to come here today.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Emily. I was here last week, but yeah. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I decided to start coming to these because I am working with Michelle in the curator group for the Andean and Amazonian Indigenous Artifact and Cultural Art Collection. So yeah.
So yeah, that was, so sorry, Emily, for reintroducing yourself, but thank you. And so
maybe Emily, before you move on to the next, Emily is working on a specific project that has to do with storytelling. So do you want to just say a couple of words about that?
Yeah, so I'm working with a researcher named Sue Cult to discover different ways of incorporating kind of more indigenous storytelling traditions into like lower education learning. So she is trying to develop a children's book that's going to be in Quechua, English, and Spanish, all on the same page. And what she wants to do is translate this woven tapestry done by a master weaver in um, and try to translate the way that the story is told in the weaving into this kind of picture book type of scenario. And the way we're looking to do that is through kind of some more different like interpretive artistic styles, and also kind of designing the book in a way so that it flows in a more active way rather than how you typically read in a more passive storytelling capacity. So
Thank you, Emily. So yeah, so Malcolm, you are the only new
Yes.
member today, but it's again the presence of one new person changes the whole dynamic, and that's what's so important in this. So yeah, so please introduce yourself.
Thank you for the welcome. My name is Malcolm Miguel Boto. I'm originally from Argentina, but have lived in the US for many years now. I work at Brigham Young University. I have been teaching Quiche for several years, a Mayan language from Guatemala, but also work at the Kennedy Center for International Study programs. And so I work with study abroad and internship programs and field schools. I'm also in several committees. One of them is the Department of Dance has a committee on diversity and inclusion. And I also am in the board for the Festival Latinoamericano in our community. And so in these different realms, I am really interested in telling stories, right? And decolonizing the way we tell stories here in the US about Latin America and how we tell our own stories as Latin American. My wife is from Guatemala, and so she does write. She's a children's story writer. And so just for many different aspects, I was interested in when I saw this announced, and I thought, oh, I should jump into this.
Well, welcome, and
Have you?
yeah.
Thank you.
So let us briefly introduce, so Emily has introduced herself, so maybe we can go around just introduce ourselves to Malcolm. I'll start. So I'm Richard Fletcher. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Arts, Administration, Education and Policy. I'm one of the co-PIs for this group for the Cachawilacuna project. And my main interest is in questions of decolonial arts education, and specifically moving into questions of how a non-Indigenous person like myself can be part of a teaching of global Indigenous art making across the board. And I will just say one thing that I think that what both you, Malcolm and Emily, brought to mind is this question of the whole scope of education in terms of where storytelling takes place within educational formation, and the question of children's art and children's stories. And I've been recently reading Herbert Reed's Education Through Art, which has a whole section about children's art making, and I'm thinking a little bit about, what's, not only, what kind of space we have for unlearning to begin as early as possible. and so that's something I'm quite interested in, just raised by what both of you are, how bilingual and trilingual education can be a really important unlearning mechanism. And so just to appreciate that. So maybe I could just introduce Michelle to introduce herself.
Okay. So hi, I'm Michelle Wibbelsman. I'm in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and my area of emphasis is Indigenous cultures of Latin America, focusing specifically on Indigenous epistemologies. I'm the faculty curator for the Andean and Amazonian Indigenous Arts and Artifact Collection, and I also direct the Andean Music Ensemble at Ohio State. And yeah, so that's sort of my interest in this particular group. especially thinking about the methods that sort of emerge, from those indigenous perspectives and practices and how they might inform some of our teaching here. We are very interested in taking a more active part in the broader discussion of diversity. And we omit mention of inclusion just because that still sort of evokes a marginal space somehow, in a dominant system. So diversity really reflects ideas of pluricultural, multicultural, plurinational, like these types of words that sort of come up from indigenous perspectives in Latin America. Malcolm, I'm so excited for your participation because it also brings us to an awareness of hemispheric comparisons, not just from the Andean Amazonian region, but throughout Latin America. And then extending into the north, so like the types of discussions that we have with our Native American counterparts. There's another group, that forms that. So yeah, broadening out from our local perspective into the broader. Yeah, so I'll just leave it there and pass it on to Jonathan.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Burgoyne. I'm in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese also. I study medieval Iberia, mostly late medieval Iberia. I've worked on some manuscript transmission of vernacular literature in Spain and Europe. But I've been working on actually storytelling now that I was just thinking as Michelle talked, ever since my dissertation, really. I've always been writing about storytelling in one way or another. And I have a book project going on, which isn't really the main reason why I joined this group, and certainly not the reason why I came back for the second meeting. I feel a little bit like we're almost in a 12-step program here with this unlearning and the call to keep coming back. I think that's also part of their groups. So that's wonderful. But no, I'm working on another project right now. It's kind of ongoing. I'm looking at alternative ways of creating knowledge systems through storytelling in the Middle Ages. I could go into more detail. The sorts of sources that I'm looking at, the kinds of stories that I'm looking at are sometimes really just very fragmented kinds of narratives, what I call spatial storytelling, that happen in, the ones that I'm working on presently are in hunting manuals, some in Latin, some in French, and some in Castilian, and learning about studying how storytelling recreates different networks of knowledge that different compared to what, right? So I don't want to get into some Foucauldian conversation about discourse, but nevertheless, there is an alternative way of creating knowledge in these medieval texts. So that's what I'm interested in right now. I don't know if that ties to social justice so much. I don't think there's a lot of social justice happening in these texts that I'm studying, but that's who I am and what brought me here. That and just looking forward to an hour to unlearn. Oh, and passing on, yeah, popcorn style. I think that's also a 12-step feature. I don't know. How about Eric?
Hi, I'm Eric Johnson. I'm the curator for Thompson Special Collections, which is a division of the Special Collections Department at Ohio State's University Libraries. My own background, like Jonathan, I'm a medievalist, but I focus pretty broadly on book history. Within that realm, manuscript studies and medieval manuscript studies is my focal area. I'm, like Richard and Michelle, a co-PI on the Pachaysana project. And where I come from with this is, of course, books and manuscripts convey stories. They're tools for storytelling, and the texts that are in them. But what I'm particularly interested in are the ways that information objects as artifacts can also tell stories. So whether that's a traditional printed book or a traditional manuscript, or adaptations of those things in modern or alternative formats, like Michelle's very familiar with my work with, say, Don Quixote and Miguel Cervantes, and how that text has been reconceptualized in so many ways in chromo cards and chromo albums, matchbooks, trade ephemera, posters, political propaganda, all sorts of things, and how something that is a really archetypal story or an iconic story can be retasked for all sorts of purposes. So kind of the constant shifting way that stories develop and can be retasked for different purposes depending on the way they're packaged in their physical form is one of the things I'm very interested in. And I'll put him on the spot and pass it to my brother, Kurt, who's at the bottom of my screen.
You're at the bottom of my screen. Hi, I'm Kurt. I'm Eric's brother, like you just said. And Eric is the reason I found out about this in the first place. I'm kind of a member of the public right now. I'm in West Virginia. We have about 20 inches of snow outside. It's gorgeous. I'm here now, but I've lived in many places and traveled a lot of places, and I'm just very interested in lots of things. I'm trained as a musician and an archivist and a preservationist of rare materials, but I work in a t-shirt factory right now and hike a lot. But Eric and I grew up in South America and on the Texas Mexican border, and I was lucky enough to be able to participate in the Indian music ensemble with Michelle last semester. And anyway, I'm really happy to know everybody, and this hour I look forward to everybody. So, thanks. Hi, Tamara. Tag.
Hi, I'm Tamara Mcdermott, and I'm a first-year PhD student at Ohio State in the Arts Administration, Education, and Policy program. I'm an artist and an educator, and I'm very interested in the intersection of image and text. And actually, since last week and our storytelling workshop, I started a new collaborative project with a student in the MFA writing program, and we'll be, I'd love to share it with you all down the road. We just met, and we're going to be essentially interconnecting our stories and creating a book together through the exchange of image and text over the course of the next month. And then we'll move into an analysis of that through an analog exchange. So I'm really excited about, learning, unlearning about different techniques and ways to communicate and exchange with one another as both an art practitioner and an educator. And, these methods, as Michelle said, integrating those into our teaching practices. And then I'm also really excited to be working with Michelle and Emily with the Amazonian and Andean collection of objects. And we'll be working to catalog, to get the database and catalog of that collection up to date. And yeah, look forward to seeing all of you hopefully in future weeks as well.
Thank you, everyone. So something I thought, so actually, Tamarin, your response made me think of a ways to proceed here. And one is to state that, as not everyone was there. So there's that sense of kind of trying to summarize what happened last week. But I thought that a way into that might be just, maybe just as Tamarin did, talk a little bit as we kind of bring information from what happened in the seminar last week, in the workshop last week, maybe bring some other elements in our working life or our personal life or anything we want to do that kind of were maybe activated or made us kind of maybe more self-aware about those things that we're doing in relation to storytelling. So as Tamarin said, you've embarked on a new project and you're seeing it within that framework. So maybe if I could just flip back to you, Tamarin, and say, what elements in the workshop last week are you kind of looking forward to? So it's a way of kind of remembering what happened last week, but also projecting forward as we move forward. And then, I can, as we all think about what ways to do this, we can then jump in.
Sure. Yeah, I think, and it probably subconsciously infected my thinking, because I did develop the idea for this collaboration earlier this week since the workshop, and looking back at my notes from last week, thinking about this experience of like working and creating together, like intersections between our stories. And another question that really stood out was, how do we tell the stories of the stories we've collected? And so the process that will unfold in the next month will involve things that come up in my daily life that I want to just kind of share or get a response to. That could be a visual response, or could be text, and see what happens. And in the course of the workshop, we were asked to bring an object, and we were asked to then think about that object through time, like the past, the future. And I brought an object that I had made, which is a long time ago, and it was just something that I did as kind of, in a way, a sample. But as I like unpacked thinking about this object and its history, it actually like created much more of a context for it than it had up until that moment. You know, like I had never thought about it that way, and so it really allowed me to like dig deeper into something that I had created but not thought about, I guess, as much.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like maybe grabbing onto this idea of the object, we did bring the practice from the workshop into the first meeting of the curators. And you know, I tried to do what Chell does, but she does it so well that I was really trying to approximate. We kind of shared the burden of asking the questions. But basically, we
Sorry,
went.
Michelle, could you explain who Chell is, just so that we, again, just...
Yeah, sorry. Chell is one of the facilitators for the workshops, and she has this amazing voice and just an ability to sort of like immerse us in a kind of embodied, you know, physical sort of space in relation to the questions that we raise about storytelling. So she had done something that she had done last semester also, was a very embodied meditative land acknowledgement, you know, and the most impactful thing about that was how much time she took with it, and how slow, you know, we were encouraged to really think about where we were and think about the people who were here before. Just connecting with the land in different ways through our personal stories or our institutional stories, that type of thing. But it takes its time. You know, we take breaths in between, we close our eyes, we really imagine, you know, like all of these different connections. So for me, both times that we've done that exercise, it's been incredibly powerful. And I think it's powerful also in the sense that it goes completely against any kind of tokenizing of the land acknowledgement, you know, like where you rattle it off and it's done, you know? So that real engagement with it has prompted me to look for other ways of engaging the land acknowledgement for our group, right? But we took that sort of slow practice to our objects in the collection. The curators came into the room, and there were some items displayed in our workroom. And the initial impression was very general, right? Like, so they saw the objects, I kind of described what they were: paintings, carved gourds, you know, some little figurines that we had, you know, things like that. And then when we did the meditative practice, I encouraged people to hold the objects, right? And to sometimes close their eyes, sometimes not, but explore the different senses that we use to look at the thing, you know. And we started realizing more and more and more detail, you know, and speaking much more profoundly, you know, about what these objects might be, you know. It was an opportunity to raise questions about materials. So it's a very inquiry-led sort of thing, right? To ask about what the materials might be, who the artists might have been, you know, thinking into the future, you know, like what is our role in terms of maintaining or preserving these objects, you know? And then maybe getting into a little bit of the substance of the workshop about how objects can tell stories. What is a story? How does it unfold? You know, in very different ways in that sort of setting. So sorry, I'll stop there and just get reactions. But Emily was there, and Tamara was there also.
Michelle, I just to organically feed off what you're saying, and I don't know if these other contexts were part of your reflection on land acknowledgement. But my whole week was devoted to land acknowledgement discussions after our workshop. There were, I'll put these links in the chat, there were two specific programs at OSU that the question of land acknowledgement came up. The first was this digital dialogue about post-human rights, indigeneity, and environmental justice, which had several scholars from OSU together, and the question of land acknowledgement came up there. And then the Office of Diversity and Inclusion had a webinar on land acknowledgement called Beyond Land Acknowledgements. And it was actually in both those scenarios, I mentioned that Cachawilacuna has, thanks to you, Michelle, created its own land acknowledgement, and I'll put that in here as well. And I just wanted to, one thing that I think is, this land acknowledgement, I don't know if you were there on the session, the first session that I described, the digital dialogue, Michelle, but that our land acknowledgement was read out at that meeting. And I put in the chat, the problem was they described it as a discovery theme land acknowledgement. So as if this was the land acknowledgement for all of the groups, and as Michelle is shaking her head. And so I said, it's very important to tell the story of this land acknowledgement, which included a collaboration with an Ohio State undergraduate student, Avkukan Nokizi, who came to our session, and Michelle dialogued with him and his artwork. And this got into a question mark about how land acknowledgement, and this happened in the ODI panel, of land acknowledgement is an ongoing process. It's not suddenly it's done and it's there and it's just something to know. It's actually, it continues to be formed by dialogue, by more specific context and all these kinds of things. And I think that that was something that I've been reflecting on the whole week in relation to Chell's embodied conception of the land acknowledgement, but how it kept returning again and again and again. And at a university, sometimes there's that feeling of the problem of repetition and like people speaking across each other and not actually kind of, you know, with the discovery themes, I felt that. At the same time, it felt really interesting to get stories of land acknowledgement coming from such a variety of places. So yeah, it's been strange how that one issue has been rolling, you know, like a snowball all week for me. Thank you. So I just wanted to latch onto that since you mentioned it, Michelle.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, and I worked afterwards with this student, Arfkuken, and he actually structured it for us because I had kind of like put it all together, and he wanted to separate out, you know, like the institutional land acknowledgement from an acknowledgement from his own words, you know, as an artist and also as a member of one of the indigenous groups, right? We wanted to include the art, you know, as a very powerful sort of statement, and just the artist perspective about spaces and lines, you know, and erasures, you know, so maybe thinking about what Richard is saying, that the repetition of the names, you know, of these groups is not enough, because in the end, if we just repeat the names without knowing much about them, ultimately it adds up to erasure. Jeff Agnoli just sent out an announcement about culturally responsible research and researchers. And he included a really interesting map, and I put it in the chat here, native land acknowledgement, but I can kind of share my screen and see if we can see it just very quickly. Let me see if I can find it now. Here. So it's a completely different map, you know, that sort of includes, like, as you scroll across it, the states are not there, but the names of the people are there, you know, and as you click on it, you know, then you can kind of go in, you know, to learn a little bit about that. So I would say that that is my challenge to the group. I'll leave this link on the chat, and hopefully I've asked Jeff if we can include it in our land acknowledgement page, which continues to develop. So there are a couple of videos actually of people talking about the land from Pachaysana webinars, the land acknowledgement that Pachaysana did, which is an embodied acknowledgement to include. So that site is going to keep growing, you know, as we sort of flesh this out, you know, as a very intentional kind of, I guess, disrupting, you know, just the formatted, you know, type of land acknowledgement. So yeah, but I wonder if Emily and Tamara can talk about how we took it beyond that, right? Like that, just that idea of like sitting with something and taking the time with something, and how that encourages sort of a deeper connection or a deeper view of things. I don't know how you guys felt about that exercise. We did it the best that we could, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, so one thing that I really enjoyed and appreciated about the exercises, I remember when Chell was running it, and what we later did with our group was she invited us to close our eyes and kind of focus on sensing the object in different ways. And right now my research is focused on multisensory experiences with artifacts. So that was something that I was really interested and intrigued in. And I remember when we were with the collection group, I chose to kind of try and connect with this object of like 4 dolls that were sewn together. And so closing the eyes and connecting with it through the other senses of touching the fabric and going through it, then realizing like the bits of dirt that was still stuck in there and the pieces of hair that were kind of just stuck in there as well, not intentionally, but just through processes of transport and stuff. And then also I remember when we were running it, Michelle then asked if we wanted to like smell it as well. So that was another like interesting sensory experience. And through doing that, it kind of reasserted this idea that taking sight out of the factor and allowing you to engage with an object in another way opens up your mind to the different paths that the object's been through. So I found myself looking more onto the material aspects of the object. So where exactly this cloth came from in the earth, and how it journeyed to the museum, as opposed to looking at it and thinking specifically about maybe like why it was designed in a certain way. You're thinking more about the material aspects of it. So that was something that I really got and appreciated from that exercise. So
Can I share something just as from what I'm hearing? I just want to tie it into something in the Quiche language. There is no word for, well, there's a word for to like something, of course, but you express it by the way you experience it. So if you like something because you see it, then you use the word to see, right? I see it well, or I taste it, or I feel it well, or I hear it well, which is a very different way, right? of experience, and something which is wonderful that you had that experience in the previous workshop. So that's all.
And I'll just quickly add that Michelle started that exercise off leading us like Shell did, but then she asked me to lead a part of it and Emily to lead a part of it. And I'll just say that kind of experience was at first very challenging to be like to lead that other people's journeys, you know. But as I did it, it became much more fluid. Like it just really kind of unfolded like my directing of, you know, and I think Emily, I would imagine had a similar, I don't know, kind of experience that at first I was like a little nervous, like, how do I do this? Shell's amazing. Michelle, you know, did a great job. And that idea of leading others through a journey was, yeah, that was a different perspective to kind of take into it.
And maybe, you know, this is something that they emphasize in the workshops, right? That we can talk about change, but the challenge is how do we go about it, right? And also very strongly as part of the Pachaysana, you know, mission and vision in general is about rehearsing change. Like how can we implement change if we don't rehearse it? So it's very different to participate in an exercise versus reading about an exercise versus actually taking on the role of doing it and implementing it, and not just one time, but potentially as a habit, right, in our classes, just to see how it flows better. Like Tamara was saying, eventually we kind of all got comfortable to some extent. I think next time we'll be more comfortable, perhaps, and maybe lead other people as we, beyond the curators group, as we do workshops with classes or the public, to lead them through this exercise and experience it each time differently, you know?
Richard, can you explain that comment? Because it's not the first time I've heard it. I don't know that I've gotten to that point yet with chat feature. In other sites I visit, I have experienced, well, I don't know anything close to a transformation, but I'm aware of the potential of chat and have participated in it in other venues. But what did you mean by the use of chat function in the workshops was transformative?
Yeah, so not just last week, but then maybe, but throughout the Pachaysana workshops, the constraints of doing these workshops virtually on Zoom has changed, has necessitated a certain use of kind of gathering of responses to materials that instead of kind of going around the table, as it were, it's asking for responses that are often quite grounded in emotional responses to certain ideas. And so Daniel or Chell or other Pachaysana members of the team would request responses to either activities, to general questions, to appear in the chat. So there's that, and then they would read out the chat. And I think the reading out of the chat is quite an important element as well. And so you actually hear your comments in someone else's voice,
Right.
and it actually accumulates as well. And it's very simple. It's not like, it doesn't feel like mind blowing when describing it, but it creates an element of communal creativity at the same time. And in other workshops last year, we ended up creating text based on the chat and this exchange of words and responses. And I'm actually it's interesting to think about it here, because why, when we're in the workshop, do we use this? But then when we're reflecting on the workshop, we use the chat for a little bit more of a, hey, check out this website, or, do this kind of thing, and a more, so we don't use the chat in our reflections. Maybe it's because we're not as we're not leading the workshop, as it were, and we're not thinking about that. So maybe others have other reflections on how the chat kind of changes our dynamic, and also specifically about storytelling, like how to it's like how to be self-aware of the media that we're using, that, and not to just, and actually to look at it with a slightly from kind of a curious statement. It's just what Emily was describing, like shutting off certain senses. For example, what would it mean if we stopped talking now and just held this dialogue in the chat for 5 minutes, right? How would that change the dynamic of our conversations? We can do that if you feel like doing that. Or Eric is going to say something and we can move on.
I was just going to say, I really like chat in some ways, but I also get really annoyed with it sometimes. Like what you were saying about taking the time to actually go through and then vocalize what's in the chat stream, I think can be really, really powerful and occasionally transformative. The thing that I have trouble with sometimes is in my brain, I equate chat to my hatred of endnotes as opposed to, say, footnotes, because I'll be reading along in a book that has endnotes, and then you see that tantalizing number related to something you've just read, and you really want to see it, rather than just cast my eyes straight down to the foot of the page. And now I have to break the narrative flow even further and go dig for it at the back of the book. And chat for me is somewhere between endnotes and footnotes. Like it is like I've got it open right now on the side of my screen and I can just bounce over and look. But when chat is really, really active, it's really difficult for me at any rate to kind of keep track of what everyone's saying, the links that are appearing on the page, because the links, like sometimes the chat is going so quickly that everything just starts disappearing. And so I'm frantically clicking on links just to open up tabs so that I can go back and look later. And then other people are commenting on those things vocally, but then other people are commenting on them in the chat. And so when it's really, really vibrant, it's really exciting. But for me, it also becomes anxiety producing. So it's like I'm still trying to figure out my way with some of this. The other thing that I think is a real problem for me, and I don't know if any of you have tips on this, but I have yet to find a way to make long chat strings in Zoom navigable easily, because it jumps so quickly every time you try to scroll through it. And so that makes it really, really hard too. But I agree with you. It's a really powerful tool and can really, really help. But last semester when I was teaching the manuscripts course and we did some synchronous Zoom sessions, some of the students afterwards would complain about, you know, how quickly things were moving in chat and how do we get that under control?
So maybe in a way, you know, like rather than chat being something that forces us to multitask, right, where we're doing both things at the same time, what they did in the workshops is that they actually dedicated the space to the chat with a prompt, you know. So we might try that. I mean, you know, I can think of maybe Richard, you can help me out here, but one prompt might be, what is a story to you? You know, like, and just how, you know, thinking about like the many different ways that we can conceive of what a story is. Another very productive prompt, and I think Kurt can kind of attest to this, is we did this in our music ensemble. We were addressing the issue of radical listening, right? So we went from listening, close listening, you know, directed listening to radical listening. And then the one that really stumped us, and we tried to do by way of chat in different ways, is radical dreaming, which gets us to potentially the issue of social change. So I don't know, Richard, do you want to pick maybe a prompt and we can attempt this chat function maybe just as to see how it works?
I'm happy with either of those. So, you know, what is a story? And I mean, I think, you know, maybe because we're not running the workshop here, maybe in the let's do something slightly different, which is let everyone make sure everything that is written in the chat is read, but who reads it is open. So it's not one person that reads it, but someone else might feel like reading, but you can't read your own word. Let's just make that kind of rule. So yeah, so the question is, what is a story? Well, what is a story? And we can have our mics on and read. But yeah, just make sure everyone's story gets everyone's.
Let's give everybody just a minute to kind of come up with their answer. So we'll let them accumulate, and then we'll start the reading once everyone is sort of done.
Okay.
Wow, we have a lot of responses. Good. So should we start the reading part?
Sure.
New messages, 3 new messages. It keeps going. Wow. Okay. Fantastic. So, I'll kick it off. So a story. What is a story? A story is malleable.
Well, let me tell you.
Multivocal.
Connection.
Description.
Transmission.
Translation.
Layered.
Embodied.
Once upon a time.
Evolving.
And unfolded.
Interactive.
A perceived experience, identity.
Unfolding in what direction?
Away.
Going somewhere.
Any direction.
Manipulable? Is that a word?
He uses that word.
Invention.
Movement.
Sharing.
Creativity.
Edutainment. I like that one. Okay.
I take that
Collective.
from Glendine Olson's Literature as Recreation, you know, that idea.
Oh, trust me, I could have gone on and on. This is a great, impossible question.
Yeah. And then Malcolm writes connection. I think somebody already wrote that. There we go. Oral, right? Exactly. Yeah. So what do we make of this? I mean, this is really provocative for me. Like all of them speak to each other in different ways. You know, like even starting with Malcolm's last comment, connection. I think already somebody already wrote that. The idea of reiteration or repetition is really important, right? In storytelling. So I don't know if it brings up other things for other folks. Even in terms of thinking about the function of the chat in this particular use.
Oh, well, I did have something to say about the function of chat, and listening to Richard's explanation confirmed what I thought he was talking about, but maybe that's a little, just slightly off the subject. But just looking at these words, I'm struck one by the free association, the word for word equivalencies, the lack of almost any attempt to define it, even though the question asks for one. So this is a really great group of unlearned people who are already onto the game, right? So I don't know what to make. I'd have to go over that list, right? It's a great list. Are these equivalencies that were being made? Are they modifications? Are they descriptions of what storytelling is for them, or is it some aspect about storytelling? That's wonderful, the list. Because I mean, I think a lot of us here have too many definitions in our mind. I certainly know that I do, right? That's why I barely wanted to write anything, because my mind is so cluttered with years and years and years of defining what a story is and what it isn't. Or no, really, I don't know about what it isn't. But I wanted to just share something though about maybe it has to do with the storytelling and the use of this transformative use of this chat. What I think you struck me, Richard, was that when you don't use chat as a way to just share information like a link or but when you're actually involving chat in some sort of an exercise, it reminds me a little bit of groups like this that aren't academic, right? Where a group of people come together to help themselves or to explore something. And the reason why we have groups like that is because people share their stories, people listen and repeat, and each person doesn't have an answer to what a story is or to whatever they've come together to find out. But what happens, and it's kind of a mystery, right, is that collectively, right, there is wisdom, there are answers, there is progress, there is insight that is greater than the sum of the insight of the individuals, right? So that's what I thought you were, that's what I thought you were getting at when you were talking about how the chat feature can become transformative. I mean, anybody who's ever sat on someone's couch also knows that, you know, not facing somebody, breaking through the discomfort of looking someone in the eye, but yet still, anybody who's ever been to a confession, you know, knows that writing down something and having somebody else say it out loud, and I mean, every tradition I can think of that has any spiritual component to it has emphasized this idea of saying out loud something that's on your heart to another human being, because something happens in that process that's greater than the two people involved. Some insight, some discovery, something.
Jonathan, the other thing that happens in this moment, and I think, you know, every single one of us, as you were speaking, were thinking, right? We were all thinking. Maybe we were thinking about something to say, to follow up, as some way to respond to what you were saying. But I presume that every one of us was somehow processing what you were saying with a way of moving it somewhere else, or giving an example, or giving confirmation of what you're saying. And specifically what I was thinking about at that moment, just to share this particular thing, it's a bit, it's very personal, but I think it's relevant to the tenor of what you were saying, Jonathan, which is, my father passed away last year, and round about this time of last year, I went to see him in England, and he wasn't doing very well. Like, he wasn't being able to speak as well as he wanted to. But I had a voice recorder, and I really just wanted to talk to him and kind of record him, and just, you know, to remember this moment. And he started to talk about how in our lives, we can kind of think of 10-year periods as kind of enough time to think of it as kind of coherent enough, long enough for it to kind of mean something, to kind of look back on a 10-year period. And for those in the younger phase among us, you may not have made it to your second 10-year period, or you may be close, but and then as he was saying this, which I'm really grateful I have this as a recording, he started to saying, I can't do this. I can't have this recording. I can't have it there sitting between us as I'm talking to you. And so he was very like, it was like what he was saying was so precious, but at the same time, the mechanism was, so I think what you're saying about the chat is, you know, it seems so kind of, I don't know, just not, there's a problem with it as a mechanism that goes into the spheres of our lives, of recording, of free association, but that kind of puts us off. But at the same time, it also can register something kind of profound too. So anyway, it's that kind of tension.
What
that
I wanted,
I feel
that your comment was that it doesn't stay in the chat, right? We all read it, right?
Yeah.
And so it comes back into our face-to-face interactions, or our group interaction, however that is, right? And I don't know if you've seen it, but I've done these sorts of exercises in groups before, where people write down, and then but the point is it's not just to catalog ideas or to share information. It's actually, it's a part of a collective creativity, right? So it has to come back. So that part about, well, we're all going to read it, right? Yeah. That bringing it back, right, makes it not just a chat anymore, not just in that box. Right? Yeah. Not relegated.
I love it how it's used and how we used it right now, you know, where every response is a prompt. You're right, Jonathan, we didn't even really respond to the original question. It was just a prompt, you know, to say any way you take this is fine. So I love that. I love, for example, the insights that we gain. Like, I find very endearing the the banter between the two brothers, the two Johnson brothers, you know, of like, is it a word? Yeah, I use it, you know. So that insight that we gain from that little interaction, even in 2 lines, is invaluable, you know. And then things that prompt other things, like Kurt, you said it's manipulable, right? And this idea of like, stories are changing. you know, they're not fixed. It brought up like this entire sort of what Richard was saying, we keep thinking and talking, you know, to ourselves as we react to these. So I don't know if if it's not multitasking, getting back to Eric's qualm with chat, you know, if it's not multitasking, I think it seems pretty productive, you know. I don't know if other people have found that or.
I really love it. In a way, it reminds me of improvising with other musicians, because you're making something that might or might not be coherent, but you're interacting with each other. We appreciate things like that. Something happens that you can't do by yourself.
Something as well as I've just been teaching, and I have a series of breakout rooms in it's a class with like 60 plus students, and there's 10 breakout rooms, and I have to use you can make statements to the breakout rooms, but they can't communicate with you. And I said to them, okay, I want to be part of your discussions, but I'll only come to your breakout room if you invite me. And so I started just saying how lonely I was sitting here waiting for some breakout room to invite me. And I started like putting song lyrics I put like So Lonely by the Police. And I think there's some Justin Bieber song about being lonely. And, you know, I started to kind of sing at my students, and finally a student invited me, but it took a while to kind of, so I actually grateful that the chat exists for all of us at this moment, because in breakout rooms, it's really not as open.
Maybe also thinking about this in terms of inclusion, right? Like including a diversity of voices, you know, where the way that we express ourselves verbally, you know, maybe people are more willing to share kind of their thoughts via the chat. So this idea of mechanisms for ensuring inclusion, you know, of variety of perspectives, a variety of voices, and then from there, changing the mechanism, right? Like thinking about like not just representing different voices in different formats, but changing the formats, you know.
I thought I'm very annoying about maintaining our 1 hour limit for this. So we will close now. I will do one thing though, Malcolm, to mark your presence today. I was wondering because the other thing I was thinking about this is a recording, so there's going to be a transcript. And I was just thinking if there's a phrase or some words that you could speak to us in Quechua that we could then see how they come out in the transcription of this meeting, that we could just see how the limits of this. So I mean,
Richard,
I don't know
you
if
have such a refined sense of delectatio ludere.
So Quiche, not Quechua. Yeah, so Quiche.
No
I don't know. Just then, and we can leave Malcolm with the last note, and then we'll just say goodbye, and we'll have that as to read it later for us.
Otzbala. Nabe kwach kimaltiushich chiwech mal inkoi wuk chanim I otzle hastakshin shinwetamach iwuk pa weich maltiosh chiwech I pahunchik ich kakelkib. Maltiosh.
Wonderful. Maltiosh.
Thank you. Bye-bye.